Today's victim, Retina IIIC, big C. This one, I think it's got a few problems. The first thing I noticed when I picked it up was that the door is very stiff. So it's quite stiff to open, like there's a bit of resistance there, like the bellows perhaps have gone a bit hard, who would know. Or it might just be grease and dirt in the mechanism. The angle of the door, you can see that it's got quite a sweep to the inside. That's not right. It means it's had a thump. The arms are probably a bit bent. When that happens, it means that the arms push that front standard back into the body. If they're bent in that particular fashion, when it's closed, they push that front standard back as far as they possibly can in the body, and what that does is it jams the action of that transfer shaft, which takes the action from the cocking rack to the shutter. In some cases it means that the action's very stiff, and so that the film advance sticks because the rack has got far too much resistance there. So if I open the front door, probably find that that pops back there quite nicely. That's a typical example. By loading up the cocking rack at that point, it means that you're liable to strip the teeth off the cocking rack at this point. So with Retina IIIC cameras, it is best policy to not wind on the film while the front of the camera is closed, for this particular reason. When the camera is fully functional and hasn't been dropped and everything's running perfectly, it's not a problem. But it's a hard one to spot unless you know to look for it. Easiest answer, don't wind the film on with the camera closed. Simple. So we've got that going on. What else can we see here? I can cock the shutter, but it won't release. The shutter release is jammed solid. Now I'm fairly confident the shutter is cocked, and if I press down here on the shutter lever itself, the shutter will fire. So there's a jam between the shutter release button at the top and the mechanism here. So that's a bit unusual. I'm not sure what's caused that. Possibly there's something is jamming underneath that release. Anything else? Well, there's this. The whole end of the top cover there moves backwards and forwards, strap lug and all. So it means the strap lug is loose. If the strap lug is loose, it means that the rack is not being held down firmly at that end over the top of the gear. So potentially it could float loose and get the teeth damaged on the rack. So this has got a few issues, I would say. What can we tell from the bottom of the camera? Well, that leatherette is a pretty ugly example. It's peeled away, and here that leatherette patch is not exactly circular. It's been cut from something with a pair of nail scissors most likely. It's not circular. It doesn't look particularly good. So we know someone's been in at the base of the camera. Anything else to spot? Well, I can see it. I'm sure you wouldn't be able to. The screw head here and here are just sitting up. They're proud of that cover. This does not look like an original screw, though it could be if it's been worn out enough to flatten it off. This one here is sitting up in a raised position. This doesn't want to return to the rest position, so there's something wrong there. I would say that the spring is somehow trapped or damaged. I can tell from the look of here that that's glue or something here from that leatherette. The leatherette's pretty tired looking on the base of the camera, which is unusual because it's a part of the camera that of course doesn't see much wear. Normally you would expect it to be here and here, here and here, and on here. You often see Retina IIIC cameras and they're quite scuffed out at this point, and it's from people with hard, sharp fingernails. they tuck their fingers in here and their fingernails bite into that leatherette. Anyway, I better start opening this thing up and see what we find. First thing I want to do is remove the meter from the top of the camera. So while I've got it here, I'm just going to check the position of the dial on here. And I can tell that it's 100 miles away from where it should be. So it tells me that someone has had that meter off. The screw's a little bit chewed up looking, which would certainly meet up with my expectations there. The rewind knob, just put something through the fork and spin that off. That screw's sticking up quite a long way, it's loose. So loose screws on the top cover. All of the screws are loose. Hold my finger on the top of the meter so I don't disturb anything, and lift the cover up over the top of the meter. Have a quick look at this top cover. The shoe's a bit pushed out of shape, nothing dramatic and no great surprises. Shouldn't cause a problem. Oh, what's this? Look at this little disc of aluminium. Well, I happen to know what that's for. I also know what this is for. Now, this piece has fallen out. This is a rubber thing. That's fallen out from inside the top cover. It used to be glued down in the corner here, and its job is to hold that meter down firmly. Of course, it's not. The meter should lift off. It does. Now, this little plate here, that was the cover plate from the bottom of the meter. Its job is to keep the rubbish out from that meter so that it doesn't come to any harm. That will have to go back on there carefully. Let's have a look in here, see what we can see. The shutter release is jammed. There's certainly something odd going on there. I would say that the shaft isn't lined up with the holes down the bottom. We'll find out. I'll remove the film release lever. I'll take the shutter release button off the top there. Take the rangefinder off and put it to one side. That screws tight. That screw is okay too. I'll take the strap lug off at this end. Now that screw's tight. That screw was tight. I'll take the rewind mechanism off the end here, the shaft and the bush. And those screws were tight. So the cover screws were definitely loose. This is very loose, you can see that, it's flapping about. Let's take that off. Chrome trim should lift off. Interesting. Okay. So, since I'm stripping the camera right down, I can lift out the shutter release shaft because that's not going to cause me any grief. I'm going to have the whole thing apart anyway. Now here, just getting this done. So there's the post that the release button runs on, film release button, that was there. This screw is incorrect. This is a chrome plated screw, and the screw at that point should have been nickel plated. The chrome plated screw should be on the top cover. So let's just check what I pulled off the top cover and see if that's correct. What was it? It was that one. It was chrome plated. So at some stage in its career, someone has put an extra chrome plated screw in there instead of nickel plated. Probably means that they used their chrome plated screw here, got to the outside of the camera, discovered they hadn't got a chrome plated screw anymore, and got one out of stock. I'm just checking the state of this shutter cocking rack. That's in pretty good order. That should be fine. Carrying on, I'll just take the circlip off here. I'll put the springs all carefully aside in one place. I don't put them through the ultrasonic cleaner, and I'm careful not to lose them. Take the screw out here from the release lever that releases the film advance to allow you to wind on to the next position after you've taken a photo. Or ideally that action takes place at the point that you're taking the photo. Let's just check here. These screws don't appear to be too loose. I'll just take that spring off that. That's for the little ratchet, the pawl that stops the film advance from backing up. I'll undo that screw from the centre. The gear from the top of the film advance, the washer. That's a bit grimy looking. Sometimes it's difficult to tell under the dirt whether the parts will clean up well or whether you're looking at corrosion or some other problem. These two screws, it's important that they are tight, otherwise the bush, this is the bush that supports the top of the film advance. If the screws are loose, the bush can shift slightly, which means that the gear and the rack are not held in firm alignment. There wasn't a problem here with this camera. That's the top of the camera for now. I need to turn my attention to the base of the camera and start with these leatherettes. Right, first we'll start with this, well, I think you call it more a polygon than a circle. The adhesive is pretty sticky. I think it's probably that sort of double-sided tape rubbish, but let's have a quick look. No, it doesn't look like it. Certainly that's not retinette leatherette. That's something much harder. And that was quite a thick layer of glue. These screws holding this down, let's get them out. And that one's, the slot in that one's either blurred over or clogged. A bit of both perhaps. I'm interested to check those two screws, to see if they look like the originals. That is not. Neither is that. Okay, there are a couple of foreigners. Let's lift this off. And there's the spring. Actually, that looks relatively undamaged. I'm fairly surprised by that. I thought that would be worse than that. Get some of this glue off here so I can see the screws. Now that's floating around a bit. Oh, that's pretty gooey. I'm going to put a bit of solvent on there to soften that up. I'll never get those screws out. Right, that should soften that adhesive up. Now it does. Means I can get those screws out now. That adhesive has just turned to a jelly-like substance now. That one there's complaining a bit. Someone here has, when they've applied that leatherette, instead of applying adhesive to the leatherette and then putting the leatherette in place, it looks like they put a blob of adhesive on the arm, and then oh, that's a mess, that adhesive, and it's run down the screw heads and through the holes and clogged stuff up. Yeah, that's pretty unpleasant looking. Right, so the leatherette on the base of the camera. What can we see? Well, you can see it's flapping. Look at this. It's split here. So I'm working from the edges towards the centre. It's actually coming off quite well as these things go. It's not the prettiest piece of leatherette. Some of that's because it hasn't been glued down firmly, so it hasn't been well supported, and so that the wear is quite uneven and it's lumpy and bumpy. See the adhesive on the back there. That's the kindest thing you could say, is that they were very generous with the adhesive. I've got to try and get that crap off there and get that back to clean leatherette, or I'll never be able to get that to sit flat. To a certain extent, leatherettes are one of the biggest problems with servicing old cameras like this, because if you don't have the original leatherettes, the camera never looks quite right. And of course, new leatherettes for 60-year-old cameras are somewhat thin on the ground. For some models of cameras you can get replacement leather, aftermarket leather. Some of it is very good and looks the part. Of course you can get them in all sorts of exciting colours and textures too, which never look quite the part. Right, so there's our lock lever that locks the film advance when the frame counter reaches number 1. Here's the release lever that releases the film advance so you can wind on again after you've fired the shutter. Or strictly speaking, it releases it at the time you fire the shutter. I'll take these screws out of the door here, hinge pins. That one's loose. Doesn't really come as a great surprise. And at the top of the camera, that one's loose too. There's that door, somewhat dirty looking. Obviously pretty bashed about. All these marks here to me suggest that someone's had a go at straightening that up. Probably not in a particularly clever way. Alright. I think the rewind button can come off next. I've got a pair of pliers that'll hold that while I rotate the sprocket with my thumb. And hook that spring from the lock lever for the rewind button. Three screws here will hold the film advance shaft in to the body of the camera. That screws tight. That's a good sign. Normally those screws work their way loose, or commonly they do. I wouldn't say that they're normally loose, it's just that it's not uncommon for them to be loose. If those screws are loose, it means that the film advance shaft can float about to a certain extent, and it means that the synchronisation between the point where the shutter releases and the film advance unlocks can be at a different point in the stroke of the shutter release action. And so you can end up with an annoyance where you end up having to push the film release button to release the action to allow you to wind on fairly frequently. That's the bush from the film take-up spool, plastic take-up spool, nothing exciting there, that's quite normal. Single screw here on the holds this sprocket to the shaft. Shaft comes out, there's our sprocket. Tripod socket, normally these screws are loose, in this case they are not. Oh, one of them is. Want those out anyway and clean all this. And that's just the recess that the film cassette sits in the back of the camera. The shutter. We need to remove the lens and shutter assembly from the body. That was loose. Means that the shutter was floating about to some extent, allowed to move from side to side very slightly. which means that the point at which the shutter cocks is not especially reliable in that case. Looking at this lens and shutter, well, looking at that rear lens group there, I can see immediately that there's a big splotch of fungus on the inside surface. The front's much cleaner by comparison. So that will be entertaining, seeing if I can clean up that rear lens group. Just take that out. We're down to the body now, or down, almost stripped down the body. The focus, as I say, is exceptionally stiff. This screw couples the arm on the front of the inner helical to the rangefinder on the top of the camera. That screw was a little bit loose, which probably meant that the rangefinder was incorrectly adjusted and probably wouldn't be particularly easy to correctly adjust with the screw flopping about. Alright, let's see if we can get this out. That's our coupling. You can see how it screws to the front of the inner helical, and here's the arm that holds that screw we've just removed. Just removing the screws from the shroud here that holds the gear in place, and that gear is effectively the front half of the transfer shaft. The rest of it's in the body here, and that transmits the action from the cocking racket in the back of the camera through to the shutter. From the side, this is exceptionally mutilated. Someone has attempted to adjust the stroke of the shutter release by bending this about, and here now we have the answer to why the shutter release wouldn't move. This is absolutely jammed in place. It's got an incorrect spring here of some description. I've got no idea what that was. That's not an original spring, and this arm is quite bent and it's sticking. That's why the shutter release wouldn't move. So I need to mark the position of my outer helical relative to the inner helical, and the outer helical relative to the focus scale ring. I normally scratch a line on those. With the tip of a scalpel. And the ideal point to do this is where the inner helical and the outer helical are at the same plane, which, working this backwards and forwards, seems to be about there. Normally I put 2 marks on the bottom, 1 mark at the top, and that points me in the right direction as to where to put everything back together again. So we'll remove these 4 screws. So far, what can I say about this camera? Well, some of the faults that I've noted here are certainly introduced faults. They didn't spontaneously generate themselves. They're not normal faults that you get from wear and tear or accidental damage. This sort of business, that's intentional damage. That's where somebody has done something in the wrong way and damaged things in the process. The business of the front door and its somewhat ugly looking struts is probably the result of that having been accidentally damaged, the camera having been dropped, and someone straightening it up afterwards. And this screw looks a little bit odd to me. We'll find out. That's not the right screw. The hell is that? Okay. That screw is one of the screws from elsewhere. That should have been a countersunk screw in there. So we know that someone has had the focus mechanism apart, presumably to clean and lubricate it at some stage. Wrong screw again. Correct screw. So there are 4 screws that hold this mechanism, this retainer plate in place. They're countersunk head. There are 4 screws that hold the focus scale ring onto the outer helical, and they are not countersunk. Those 8 screws had been mixed up. This screw doesn't look right to me. This screw here is one of the screws. This is one of the 2 screws that came from the surround for the tripod socket on the base of the camera, the back catch release. So the screws have all been muddled up. It means that someone has had the camera very much apart, and they haven't kept track of where the screws go, and they haven't been familiar enough with the screws to be able to tell just by looking.